Sometimes life offers second chances when we least expect them. Sometimes a single moment of kindness can change everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Luke Carver had spent 15 years alone in the Montana mountains. He came to town that evening for supplies, not expecting to find a bride abandoned on the church steps. Emma Galloway stood there in her wedding dress while the whole town watched her shame. Her groom had run off with her money. Luke stepped forward without thinking. "I don't remember women being this beautiful," he said quietly. Those words changed both their lives. Right there at sunset, this mountain man offered something no one expected: his name, his protection, and his heart. What happened next shocked the entire town. But could two broken people really build something lasting together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of pine and approaching snow down from the high country as Luke Carver guided his pack mule through the narrow streets of Cedar Falls. 15 years had passed since he'd last walked among buildings that stood close enough for neighbors to hear each other's conversations through thin walls. 15 years since he'd needed to mind his manners or lower his voice for the sake of propriety. The Montana Territory had a way of changing a man. The mountains didn't care about your past, your mistakes, or your regrets. They demanded only that you be strong enough to survive another day, smart enough to read the weather, and humble enough to respect the wilderness that could kill you with a single moment of carelessness. Luke had learned those lessons well, and they'd shaped him into something harder and more self-reliant than the young man who'd fled civilization all those years ago. His trapping knife hung at his side, its leather-wrapped handle worn smooth by countless seasons of use. The blade had skinned more pelts than he could count, carved shelter from fallen timber, and defended him against bears and wolves. It was a tool that spoke of survival, of a man who'd learned to depend on nothing but his own skills and the harsh generosity of the wilderness. But now, as evening shadows stretched across the dusty main street, Luke found himself face to face with something the mountains had never taught him how to handle. Emma Galloway stood on the steps of the little white church, like a vision from another world. Her wedding dress, though travel-worn from the long journey west, still caught the dying light with an elegance that seemed impossible in this rough frontier town. The ivory lace spoke of careful hands and patient work, of a world where beauty mattered as much as practicality. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a delicate veil that stirred in the evening breeze, and her brown eyes held a mixture of dignity and devastation that struck Luke like a physical blow. She was 30 years old, though the afternoon's humiliation had added shadows beneath her eyes that made her seem older. Emma had been educated back in Massachusetts, where her father had owned a small but respectable business manufacturing ladies' gloves. She could read Latin and speak French, had taught in a one-room schoolhouse, and could play piano well enough to accompany the church choir on Sundays. None of those accomplishments seemed to matter much now, standing abandoned in her wedding dress, while the good people of Cedar Falls whispered among themselves like vultures circling a fresh carcass. The teaching certificate tucked in her small traveling bag represented everything she'd once thought important: education, independence, the ability to support herself through her own efforts. But the journey west had cost more than she'd anticipated, and her intended groom's flight with her dowry left her stranded with barely enough money for a week's meals. All her careful plans, all her hopes for a new beginning, had crumbled in the space of a few hours. Luke had ridden down from his mountain cabin that morning, with nothing more in mind than trading pelts for winter supplies. Cedar Falls served as his connection to the wider world, a place he visited 3 or 4 times a year when necessity demanded it. The town knew him as a reliable source of high-quality furs and fresh meat, a man who kept his word and paid his debts, but also someone who clearly preferred the company of mountains to people. The townspeople respected Luke's skills and his honesty, but they'd never quite known what to make of him. He was polite enough when conducting business, but he had a way of listening more than talking that made folks uncomfortable. His grey eyes seemed to see too much, and his weathered hands spoke of a life lived far from the civilizing influences of church, socials, and town meetings. Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, had whispered to anyone who'd listen that Luke Carver was probably running from something. A man didn't spend 15 years alone in the high country unless he had good reason to avoid human company. But whatever secrets he might be harboring, he'd never caused trouble for the town, and his money was always good. Young Tom Mitchell, fresh out of seminary school, had been reluctant to perform the wedding ceremony when Emma's intended groom had failed to appear. The situation was irregular, possibly scandalous, and certainly not the sort of respectable proceeding he'd been trained to handle. But the alternative, leaving a decent woman stranded and defenseless, seemed even less Christian. So he'd stood there in his black coat, prayer book in hand, waiting for someone to decide what ought to be done. The crowd that had gathered seemed more interested in the drama than in finding a solution. Mrs. Henderson whispered to Mrs. Cooper about the impropriety of the whole situation. Old Pete Jameson muttered that no good would come of mail-order marriages, and that this was exactly the sort of thing that happened when women got too bold for their own good. Even the children sensed the tension, clustering around their mothers' skirts and staring at the pretty lady in the fancy dress who looked like she might cry. Emma had felt their stares like physical weights pressing down on her shoulders. The shame burned in her cheeks as she realized that her carefully constructed new life was dissolving before it had even begun. She'd spent her last respectable option on the journey west, had burned her bridges back home, and now found herself utterly dependent on the charity of strangers in a town that seemed more inclined to judge than to help. That's when Luke had stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden steps, his presence somehow steadying in a world that had suddenly turned unreliable. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to making his own decisions without consulting committees or considering public opinion. His voice, when he spoke, carried the rough edges of long solitude, but also a gentleness that surprised everyone present. "I don't remember women being this beautiful," he'd said, and the words had fallen into the evening silence like stones dropped into still water. They weren't flowery or practiced. Luke had never been a man for pretty speeches, but they carried a sincerity that cut through all the whispered judgments and uncomfortable shuffling. Emma had looked up at him then, really looked, and seen something in his weathered face that gave her hope. Here was a man who understood what it meant to be alone, who recognized the desperate courage it had taken for her to travel halfway across the country in search of a new beginning. His grey eyes held no judgment, no calculation of what she might cost him or how her presence might complicate his carefully ordered life. "Ma'am," Luke had continued, removing his worn hat and running his fingers through hair that had grown too long during his months in the mountains. "I know this isn't what you planned, and I'm not much for fancy words or proper courtship, but if you're willing, I'd be honored to offer you my name and whatever protection I can provide." The proposal had been delivered with the same straightforward honesty he might use when discussing the weather or the price of pelts. No grand gestures, no promises of romance or eternal devotion, just a practical solution offered by a man who seemed to understand that sometimes life required quick decisions and the courage to act on them. Young Tom had blinked in amazement, his prayer book nearly slipping from his hands. This wasn't how weddings were supposed to happen, with no banns posted, no proper courtship, no family consultation. But the alternative, watching a respectable woman face destitution and social ruin, seemed far worse than bending a few rules. Emma had felt the weight of every eye in the crowd as she considered Luke's offer. Here was a man she'd never spoken to, never seen before this moment, offering to bind his life to hers for no reason except basic human decency. The practical part of her mind catalogued the risks. He could be anyone, could have any sort of past or intentions. But something in his steady gaze and the careful respect in his voice told her that whatever dangers might lie ahead, they would be honest ones. "Yes," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening wind. "Yes, I will." The ceremony that followed had been brief and awkward, with the townspeople serving as reluctant witnesses to a union that no one quite understood. Luke's responses had been clear and firm, while Emma's voice had trembled only slightly as she repeated vows to a man whose full name she'd learned only moments before speaking it aloud. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Luke had offered Emma his arm, with the same careful courtesy he might show to any lady, and together they'd faced the uncertain future that stretched ahead of them like an uncharted trail leading into the wilderness. Now, standing in the fading light with his new wife beside him, Luke found himself wondering what exactly he'd gotten himself into. Marriage had never been part of his plans, and certainly not marriage to an educated Eastern woman who probably expected things from life that a mountain man could never provide. But looking at Emma's quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation, he felt certain he'd made the right choice, even if he had no idea how to make it work. The crowd began to disperse as the novelty wore off, leaving Luke and Emma to face the practical questions that their impulsive decision had created. Where would they live? How would they manage the awkwardness of a marriage between strangers? And most pressingly, how would they get through their first night as husband and wife without either of them dying of embarrassment? Luke cleared his throat and offered Emma his most respectful nod. "Ma'am, Emma, I've got a room at the boarding house for tonight. I'll make arrangements for separate accommodations." "Naturally. Tomorrow, if you're agreeable, I'd like to show you my place up in the mountains. It's not much by civilized standards, but it's honest shelter, and there's good water and timber for whatever improvements might be needed." Emma looked up at this unexpected husband of hers, taking in the weather-beaten face and the careful way he held himself, as if he were afraid his very presence might somehow offend her sensibilities. "Mr. Carver," she said quietly, "I think we both understand that this arrangement isn't what either of us planned. But I want you to know that I'm grateful for your kindness, and I'll do my best to be a proper wife to you, whatever that might mean under these circumstances." Luke felt something ease in his chest at her words. Whatever else might happen between them, it seemed they could at least be honest with each other. That was more than many marriages started with, and it would have to be enough. The morning sun slanted through the dusty windows of Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house as Emma stared at her teaching certificate, the parchment slightly yellowed from its journey west. The formal script declaring her qualifications seemed to mock her current circumstances. What use was the ability to parse Latin verbs when she was married to a stranger and facing a life in the wilderness? Luke had kept his word about separate accommodations, securing the boarding house's only available room for Emma, while he made do with a bedroll in the stable. She'd barely slept, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town and wondering what dawn would bring. Through her small window, she could see him now, methodically checking his pack mule's harness, with the careful attention of a man who understood that survival often depended on such details. The wedding ceremony the previous evening felt like something that had happened to someone else. Young Reverend Mitchell had stumbled through the abbreviated service with obvious discomfort, his voice gaining strength only when he reached the familiar ritual of pronouncing them man and wife. Luke's responses had been clear and unwavering, while Emma had found herself speaking vows to a man whose calloused hands told stories she couldn't read. Mrs. Pemberton, a widow who'd run the boarding house for 15 years, had provided a breakfast of biscuits and coffee with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen enough frontier drama to remain unimpressed. "Your husband seems a decent sort," she'd offered while Emma picked at her food. "Keeps to himself, pays his bills, never caused trouble. That's more than some can say." The townspeople who'd witnessed their hasty marriage had wasted no time spreading the story. Emma could hear the whispered conversations from her window, speculation about Luke's motives, judgment about her desperation, and predictions about how long such an unlikely union might last. Martha Henderson's voice carried clearly across the morning air as she discussed the scandal with anyone willing to listen. "A proper woman doesn't marry a stranger," Mrs. Henderson declared to her neighbor. "Mark my words, no good will come of this arrangement." That mountain man probably saw an opportunity and took it, and well, what does that say about her character, accepting such a proposal? Emma folded her teaching certificate and tucked it carefully into her traveling bag, alongside the few possessions that represented her entire life. Her mother's silver locket, a collection of favorite books, the blue wool dress she'd been saving for special occasions, such meager holdings for a woman of 30 who'd once imagined a different sort of future. Luke appeared at her door precisely at 8 o'clock, hat in hand and pack mule loaded for the journey. He'd cleaned up as much as frontier facilities allowed, but there was no disguising the fact that he belonged to the wilderness rather than civilization. His weathered coat spoke of long seasons in the mountains, and his boots showed the wear of countless miles on rough terrain. "Good morning, Mrs. Carver," he said, the unfamiliar name hanging awkwardly between them. "If you're ready, we can start up to my place. It's a fair ride, but the mule's sure-footed, and the weather looks to hold." Mrs. Carver. Emma tested the sound of it in her mind and found it strange but not unpleasant. She'd spent so many years as Miss Galloway, the schoolteacher, that taking a husband's name felt like stepping into an entirely new identity. Perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing, given how thoroughly her old life had collapsed. "I'm ready, Mr. Carver," she replied, shouldering her bag and following him down the narrow stairs. The boarding house's other guests, a traveling merchant and an elderly prospector, watched their departure with unconcealed curiosity. Luke helped her onto the mule with gentle efficiency, his hands careful and respectful as he adjusted the stirrups for her shorter legs. Emma hadn't ridden much, and certainly never astride in her wedding dress, but she was determined not to complain. This man had rescued her from destitution through pure kindness. The least she could do was match his practical approach to their unusual circumstances. As they rode through Cedar Falls' main street, Emma felt the weight of watching eyes from every window and doorway. The town's judgment followed them like a physical presence, and she found herself lifting her chin in defiance of their whispered criticisms. Let them talk, she'd made her choice, and she would face whatever came of it with dignity. The trail leading into the mountains began gradually, winding through foothills, covered in golden grass and scattered pine groves. Luke rode beside her on his sturdy horse, occasionally pointing out landmarks or offering quiet observations about the country they were traveling through. His voice held the cadence of long solitude, as if he'd grown unused to sustained conversation but was making an effort for her sake. "That peak there," he said, gesturing toward a distant summit, "that's where I do most of my trapping come winter. Good shelter in the draws, and the animals follow predictable paths when the snow gets deep." Emma nodded, though the wilderness around them seemed vast and intimidating. She'd grown up in Massachusetts' mill towns, where the wildest nature most people encountered was a well-maintained city park. This landscape of endless mountains and sky felt like entering another world entirely. As they climbed higher, Luke's demeanor began to change. The stiffness that had marked his interactions with the townspeople gradually faded, replaced by something more natural and confident. Here in his element, he moved with the easy grace of someone completely at home, reading the terrain and weather with instinctive skill. "Been living up here 15 years, he said during a rest stop beside a clear mountain stream. "Came up here as a young man with more anger than sense. Figured I'd stay a season or two and then move on. But the mountains have a way of keeping you, if you let them." Emma studied his weathered face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and snow. "What brought you here originally?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw him stiffen slightly. "Just needed to get away from civilization for a while," he replied carefully. "Sometimes a man has to find his own way, away from other folks' expectations and judgments." There was pain in his voice, old and well buried, but Emma was wise enough not to press further. Whatever had driven Luke to the mountains was his story to tell when he was ready, if he ever was. She'd learned patience during her years of teaching, and she suspected that patience would be essential in understanding her new husband. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered grove, beside another stream. Luke's preparations were swift and efficient, hobbling the animals, gathering firewood, setting up a simple but effective shelter using his bedroll and a piece of canvas. Emma watched his movements with growing respect, recognizing the accumulated wisdom of years spent depending on his own skills. "I'll sleep by the fire," Luke announced as he handed her a cup of coffee brewed over the flames. "You can have the shelter. It's not fancy, but it'll keep the dew off." Emma accepted the coffee gratefully, surprised by how good it tasted after the long day of travel. "Mr. Carver," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was thinking. "Just Luke, if you don't mind," he said quietly. "We're married now, even if it's not conventional circumstances. Seems like we ought to use Christian names." "Luke," she said, testing the sound of it, "I want you to know that I understand this situation is awkward for both of us. I don't expect I know this isn't a normal marriage, and I don't want you to feel obligated to—" "Emma," Luke interrupted gently, "you don't need to worry about that. I may not be much for fancy manners, but I know how to treat a lady with respect. We'll take this one day at a time, see how we suit each other. No pressure, no expectations, beyond basic kindness." That night, as Emma lay in the makeshift shelter listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she'd been Emma Galloway, abandoned bride and object of small-town pity. Now, she was Emma Carver, wife to a mountain man, and bound for a life she couldn't have imagined. The next morning brought news that would shatter their fragile peace. A rider from town found them just as they were breaking camp, his horse lathered with sweat from hard travel. "Luke Carver?" the man called. "You need to know that fellow who was supposed to marry this lady. He's been asking questions about you in the saloons. Says he's coming back with friends to settle accounts. Thought you should be warned." Luke's face went granite hard as he absorbed this information. The peaceful beginning of their mountain journey had just become something far more dangerous. The news of her former groom's threats hung between them like storm clouds as Luke led Emma higher into the mountains. The messenger had ridden back to town, but his warning echoed in the sudden tension of Luke's shoulders and the way his eyes now scanned the trail ahead with heightened vigilance. "What kind of man was he?" Luke asked, as they navigated a particularly steep section of the mountain path. "This fellow who was supposed to marry you?" Emma gripped the mule's reins more tightly, remembering Roland Hutchins with a mixture of embarrassment and growing anger. "His name was Roland Hutchins. He corresponded with me for 6 months, painted himself as a successful businessman looking to establish a ranch in Montana Territory. His letters were well-written, respectful, promising a comfortable life for the right woman." Luke's grunt suggested he'd heard similar stories before. "What kind of business?" "He claimed to own a freight company that transported goods between mining camps and settlements. Said he needed a wife with education and refinement to help him establish social connections." Emma's voice carried the bitter taste of deception. "It wasn't until I arrived in Cedar Falls that I learned the truth. He was nothing but a gambler and a confidence man, living off money borrowed against promises he never intended to keep." They crested a ridge, and Luke pointed toward a small clearing nestled in a grove of towering pines. "There," he said with quiet satisfaction. "Home." Emma's first glimpse of Luke's mountain property left her speechless. She'd been expecting a rough cabin, perhaps little more than a glorified lean-to. Instead, she saw the foundation stones of what had once been a substantial dwelling. The carefully fitted stones spoke of patient, skilled work, but the cabin itself was gone. Only the rock foundation and a massive stone chimney remained standing. "Fire took the cabin 3 years back," Luke explained, dismounting and helping Emma down from the mule. "Lightning strike during a dry spell. Lost everything except what was stored in the root cellar and the foundation work. Been meaning to rebuild, but one man working alone doesn't make much progress when there's trapping and hunting to keep up with." Emma walked among the foundation stones, running her hand along the carefully fitted rocks. The dimensions suggested a home much larger than she'd expected, 3 rooms at least, with a proper fireplace and what looked like space for a kitchen area. Someone had planned this as a real home, not a temporary shelter. "You built this yourself?" she asked, noting the quality of the stonework. Luke nodded, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. "Took me 4 summers to get the foundation right. Had to haul most of these stones up from the creek bed, fit each one by hand. The cabin itself was log construction, good pine logs, chinked tight against the weather. It was a fine home while it lasted." Emma could picture it as it had been a solid, comfortable dwelling, where a man could live with dignity and self-respect. The foundation stones represented years of patient labor, the dream of permanence in a harsh and unforgiving land. Seeing it reduced to ruins spoke to her heart in ways she hadn't expected. "We could rebuild it," she said impulsively, then caught herself. "That is, if you think I mean, I don't know much about construction, but I'm willing to learn." Luke stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his grey eyes. "You'd want to live up here? It's not easy country, Emma. Winter snows can trap you for months at a time. Nearest neighbor is 2 days' ride. When something breaks, you fix it yourself, or do without." Emma looked around the clearing, taking in the towering pines, the distant mountain peaks, and the crystal-clear stream that bubbled past the foundation. The silence was profound but not empty, filled with the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. After the crushing judgment of Cedar Falls, the wilderness felt like sanctuary. "Where would we live while rebuilding?" she asked practically. Luke gestured toward a structure she hadn't noticed, a well-built lean-to constructed against the stone chimney, barely visible among the trees. "Built that for temporary shelter after the fire. It's not much, but it's weatherproof and has room for the basics." Emma examined the lean-to with growing respect for Luke's ingenuity. The structure was small but intelligently designed, with a slanted roof that would shed rain and snow, proper drainage, and careful attention to ventilation. A simple but effective dwelling that spoke of a man who understood how to live comfortably within his means. "It's more than I had yesterday," she said quietly, "and more honest than anything Roland Hutchins ever offered." Luke began unloading the pack mule with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and purposeful. Emma watched him work, noting the careful way he handled each item, the systematic approach to organizing their supplies. Everything had its place, its purpose, its importance, in the larger scheme of mountain survival. "I'm not much for company," Luke admitted as he secured their provisions in the lean-to. 15 years of living alone makes a man set in his ways. I keep regular hours, don't waste much time on unnecessary talk, and I expect things to be kept orderly and clean. That might take some getting used to." Emma rolled up her sleeves and began helping him arrange their supplies, surprised to find herself enjoying the practical work. "I spent 8 years teaching school, Luke. Order and routine don't frighten me. What might take getting used to is learning how to live in the wilderness without getting us both killed through my ignorance." Luke paused in his work, studying her with those observant grey eyes. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect? Most city women would be crying about now, or demanding to be taken back to town immediately." Emma considered this as she folded her traveling clothes into a neat bundle. "Most city women probably have somewhere to go back to. I don't. This is my life now, Luke, and I intend to make the best of it. If that means learning to live like a mountain woman, then that's what I'll do." As if to test her resolve, a sudden commotion in the nearby brush announced the arrival of a black bear investigating their campsite. Emma froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, but Luke moved with calm authority. "Stand still," he said quietly, reaching for the rifle that was never far from his side. "He's just curious about the new smells, won't bother us if we don't bother him." The bear emerged from the trees, a massive creature that seemed impossibly large and powerful. Emma had never seen a wild bear before, and the reality of sharing the wilderness with such animals struck her with sudden force. This wasn't a children's story or a nature illustration in a book. This was real danger, requiring real skills she didn't possess. Luke stood motionless, rifle ready but not threatening, watching the bear with the patience of someone who understood wild creatures. After several tense minutes, the bear decided they weren't worth investigating further and ambled away into the forest. "First lesson in mountain living," Luke said as he lowered the rifle. "Respect the wildlife, but don't fear it. Fear makes you do stupid things that get you killed." Emma realized her hands were shaking. "How do you live with that kind of danger every day?" "Same way you lived with the danger of city streets back east," Luke replied matter-of-factly. "You learn the rules, you pay attention, and you don't take unnecessary risks. Most wild animals want nothing to do with humans. It's the ones that don't follow that rule you have to watch out for." As evening fell over their mountain clearing, Emma helped Luke prepare their first meal together as husband and wife. The work was simple but satisfying, gathering firewood, preparing coffee, sharing provisions that tasted better somehow in the crisp mountain air. "Tomorrow," Luke said as they sat by the fire, "I'll start teaching you what you need to know to survive up here. How to read the weather, how to move safely in bear country, how to find your way if you get lost. It's a lot to learn, but you seem like a quick study." Emma looked up at the canopy of stars visible through the pine branches, more brilliant than she'd ever seen in the gaslit streets of Massachusetts. "I won't disappoint you, Luke, I promise." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered what other challenges awaited them in this beautiful, dangerous country, and whether a mountain man and a city school teacher could really build a life together on foundations of necessity and mutual respect. Emma's recipe book lay open on the rough wooden table Luke had built from pine logs, its pages filled with careful handwriting that seemed almost foreign in the wilderness setting. The ingredients called for in her mother's apple cake recipe: refined white flour, granulated sugar, fresh butter, vanilla extract, might as well have been precious metals for all their availability in the Montana mountains. "Making do with what you have is the first rule of mountain cooking," Luke observed, watching Emma study her recipes with growing frustration. "Sugar comes from maple trees if you know how to tap them. Flour can be stretched with ground acorns or pine nuts. Butter's a luxury, but rendered bear fat works just as well for most purposes." Emma looked up from her book, a mixture of determination and uncertainty in her brown eyes. "My mother would faint if she knew I was considering cooking with bear fat." "Your mother never had to make a winter's supplies last until spring thaw," Luke replied with gentle humor. "Mountain cooking is about nourishment and preservation, not pretty presentation." It had been 3 weeks since their arrival at the mountain clearing, and Emma was beginning to understand the vast difference between surviving in the wilderness and merely existing there. Every task required skills she'd never needed in civilized society, from banking the fire properly at night to identifying which wild plants were safe to eat. Luke had proven to be a patient teacher, though his methods were decidedly practical. Rather than lengthy explanations, he preferred to demonstrate once and then expect her to remember. Emma found herself adapting to this approach, her mind sharpening in ways that years of formal education had never demanded. "Show me how to tap a maple tree," she said, closing the recipe book with decisive finality. "If I'm going to live in the mountains, I might as well learn to cook like a mountain woman." Luke's smile was the first truly relaxed expression she'd seen from him. "Now you're talking sense. Come on, there's a good stand of sugar maples down by the creek." As they walked through the forest, Luke pointed out details. Emma was learning to notice the way certain birds called warnings about approaching weather, the tracks that showed which animals used specific trails, the plants that could serve as food or medicine in times of need. Her world was expanding beyond the narrow confines of her former life, opening into something vast and interconnected. "Tell me about your family back east," Luke said as they examined a promising maple tree. "What brought you to the point of answering a stranger's advertisement for a wife?" Emma ran her fingers along the bark of the maple, considering how much of her story to share. Luke had been honest about his desire for privacy regarding his past, but she found herself wanting to trust him with the truth about hers. My father owned a small glove-making business in Lowell, she began carefully. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. I taught school and lived at home, helping to care for my younger sister. Everything seemed stable and predictable. Luke began making careful cuts in the maple bark, his movements precise and economical. What changed? Father made some poor investments, trying to expand the business. When the bank called in his loans, we lost everything, the business, the house, even my sister's dowry money. Emma's voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. Father died of a heart attack 6 months later. The shame broke him. Luke paused in his work, looking at her with understanding that went deeper than sympathy. And your sister married her young man anyway. His family has money, so they could afford to overlook her lack of dowry. But there wasn't room for a spinster sister in their new household. I was made to understand that my presence would be an embarrassment to their social standing. The bitterness in her voice surprised Emma. She'd thought she'd made peace with her sister's abandonment, but speaking about it aloud brought back the sharp sting of betrayal. Margaret had chosen comfort and respectability over loyalty, leaving Emma to face their reduced circumstances alone. So you decided to head west, Luke said, resuming his careful work on the maple tree. I answered several advertisements, but Roland Hutchins seemed the most promising. His letters spoke of building something permanent, creating a proper home and family. I thought I was choosing security and respectability. Emma laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Instead, I was just trading one set of illusions for another. Luke inserted a wooden spout into the cut he'd made in the maple bark, then positioned a bucket beneath to catch the slowly dripping sap. Sometimes, what looks like the worst thing that could happen turns out to be exactly what you needed. Emma studied his weathered profile, noting the careful way he avoided her eyes. Is that what happened to you? What brought you to the mountains in the first place? Luke straightened, his expression closing off in the way Emma was learning to recognize. Just needed to get away from complications, he said shortly. Sometimes a man has to choose between who he was and who he wants to become. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a meal of venison stew seasoned with wild herbs Luke had taught her to identify, Emma found herself watching her husband with growing fascination. He moved through the wilderness with unconscious grace, reading signs and signals she was only beginning to notice. Yet there were moments when she caught him looking at her with something that might have been longing, quickly masked when he realized she'd noticed. Luke, she said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer. He looked up from his bowl, wariness flickering in his grey eyes. All right. Do you regret marrying me? I know it was an impulse, a kindness you offered without thinking it through. But now that we're here, living together, building something together, do you wish you could take it back? Luke set down his spoon and studied her face in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. I've lived alone for 15 years, Emma. Made my own decisions, answered to nobody, depended on nothing but my own skills and judgment. It's been a simple life, if not always an easy one. Emma felt her heart sink, preparing for the gentle rejection she'd feared since their wedding day. But these past 3 weeks, Luke continued, watching you adapt to mountain life, seeing you tackle problems most city women would run from, it's changed something in me. Made me remember what it feels like to have someone to protect, someone to share the work and the worry with. He paused, poking at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up into the dark sky. I don't regret marrying you, Emma, but I need to know, do you regret saying yes? Because if you do, if this life is too hard or too lonely, I'll escort you back to civilization. Find some way to make sure you're provided for. Emma considered her answer carefully, thinking about everything she'd learned and lost and gained in the past month. The woman who'd stepped off the stage in Cedar Falls felt like a stranger now, naive, dependent. shaped by other people's expectations rather than her own choices. "I don't regret it," she said finally. "I'm not the same person who answered Roland Hutchins' advertisement. That woman was looking for someone to take care of her, to provide security and respectability. But the woman I'm becoming up here, she wants to be a partner, not just a burden. She wants to build something real and lasting with a man who sees her as an equal." Luke's smile was slow and genuine, transforming his weathered face in ways that made Emma's breath catch. "Then I guess we're both getting more than we bargained for." As they cleaned up after their meal, working together with the easy efficiency they'd developed over their weeks together, Emma felt something shift between them. The careful politeness of strangers was giving way to something warmer, more substantial. They were becoming real partners, bound not just by legal ceremony, but by shared work and mutual respect. The mountain nights settled around them, vast and star-filled, holding their small circle of firelight like a promise of home. The letters were hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been the cabin's main room, wrapped in oiled leather to protect them from moisture and time. Emma discovered them by accident while searching for a flat stone to use as a grinding surface for acorn flour. The board shifted under her weight, revealing a small cache that Luke had obviously forgotten about in the 3 years since the fire. Her first instinct was to replace the board and pretend she'd never seen anything. Privacy was sacred in their growing relationship, and Luke had made it clear that his past was territory he wasn't ready to share. But as she knelt there in the ruins of his former home, Emma caught sight of elegant handwriting on expensive paper correspondence that spoke of a world far removed from the mountain wilderness. The topmost letter was addressed to Lucas Carver, Esquire, in flowing script that belonged to someone with considerable education. Despite her better judgment, Emma found herself reading the first few lines. "My dearest Lucas, your father's law practice continues to flourish in your absence, though he grows more concerned each year about your refusal to return to Boston. The partnership he offered remains open, and your trust fund continues to accumulate interest, as you specified in your last letter." Emma quickly replaced the letters and the floorboard, her mind reeling with implications. Lucas Carver wasn't just a mountain man seeking solitude. He was someone with education, family connections, and financial resources he'd chosen to abandon. The weathered trapper who'd rescued her from humiliation was also a man who'd walked away from privileges most people could only dream of possessing. That evening, as they worked together preparing their evening meal, Emma found herself studying Luke with new eyes. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see traces of his educated background in the careful way he spoke, the occasional formal phrase that slipped into his conversation, the ease with which he'd discussed her own education and teaching experience. "You're quiet tonight," Luke observed, glancing up from the rabbit he was skinning with practiced efficiency. "Something troubling you?" Emma hesitated, torn between honesty and discretion. Their relationship had been built on mutual respect for privacy, but the discovery of his letters raised questions that affected both their futures. If Luke had family and resources back east, what did that mean for their life together in the mountains? "I've been thinking about winter preparations," she said, finally, choosing a safer topic. "You mentioned we'll need to preserve enough meat to last several months. How do we know we'll have enough?" Luke nodded approvingly at her practical concern. "Experience, mostly. A good hunter learns to calculate based on weather patterns, animal behavior, available storage space. It's not an exact science, but 15 years of mountain winters teaches you to err on the side of caution." As he spoke, Emma noticed again the precise way he articulated his thoughts, the vocabulary that suggested extensive reading and formal education. How had a man with legal training and family wealth ended up choosing a life of deliberate hardship in the Montana wilderness? Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving carefully up the mountain trail. Luke immediately went still, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle that was always within reach. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "Could be anyone, but strangers don't usually travel this trail without good reason." 3 men emerged from the tree line as the sun was setting, their horses tired from the long climb. Emma recognized the leader immediately, Tom Bradley, Cedar Falls' unofficial mayor and owner of the largest general store. The other 2 were strangers, dressed in the rough clothes of men accustomed to hard work and harder living. "Luke Carver," Bradley called out, raising his hand in greeting but keeping his distance. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we've got a situation in town that could use your particular skills." Luke's posture remained wary, though he nodded politely. "Evening, Tom. What kind of situation?" "Pack of wolves has been hitting the ranches south of town," Bradley explained. "Lost 6 head of cattle last week, and they're getting bolder. Came right up to the Morrison place in broad daylight. We've tried tracking them ourselves, but they're too smart for us amateurs." Emma watched Luke's expression carefully, noting the way his eyes assessed the other men and their mounts, the automatic evaluation of potential threats that had become second nature during his years of solitude. "Wolves don't usually hunt cattle unless they're desperate," Luke said thoughtfully. "Something's driven them out of their normal territory. Could be lack of natural prey, could be human encroachment on their hunting grounds. Whatever the reason," Bradley continued, "folks are getting scared. The Morrison children can't even play in their own yard anymore. We're prepared to pay well for someone who can track these wolves and deal with the problem." Luke glanced back at Emma, and she could see the conflict in his grey eyes. He'd spent 15 years avoiding entanglement in other people's problems, but his natural protective instincts were clearly engaged by the threat to families and children. "How much are we talking about?" Emma asked, surprising herself by speaking up. All 3 men turned to look at her, as if they'd forgotten she was there. $200, Bradley replied after a moment's hesitation. "Cash money, paid when the wolf problem is solved." Emma felt Luke's surprise at her intervention, but she pressed on. "And how long would this work take?" "Hard to say," one of the other men answered. "Could be a few days, could be a few weeks, depending on how smart these wolves are and how far we have to track them." Luke was still watching Emma, clearly trying to understand her interest in the conversation. She gave him a meaningful look, hoping he would trust her judgment, even though she couldn't explain her reasoning in front of the other men. "We'll consider it," Luke said finally. "Give us tonight to talk it over, and I'll ride down to town tomorrow with an answer." After the men had departed, Emma and Luke sat by their fire in thoughtful silence. The $200 Bradley had offered represented more cash money than most mountain families saw in several years, enough to buy proper building materials for their cabin, adequate supplies for winter, even some of the small luxuries that made wilderness life more bearable. "You want me to take this job?" Luke said finally. It wasn't a question. "I think you should consider it carefully," Emma replied. "Not just for the money, though that's certainly appealing, but because you're the kind of man who helps people when they need it. That's why you married me, after all." Luke poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark sky. "Tracking wolves isn't like standing up for an abandoned bride. It's dangerous work, and if something happened to me, you'd be stranded up here alone." Emma thought about the letters hidden beneath the floorboard, about the family and resources Luke had abandoned in Boston. But she also thought about the man he'd become in the mountains, self-reliant, skilled, fundamentally decent in ways that had nothing to do with social position or inherited wealth. "Then we'll have to make sure nothing happens to you," she said firmly. "Because I've grown rather fond of my mountain man husband, and I'm not inclined to give him up without a fight." Luke's smile was worth the risk of revealing too much about her feelings. Whatever secrets lay in his past, whatever choices had brought him to this wilderness sanctuary, Emma was beginning to understand that her future was bound up with his in ways that went far deeper than a hasty marriage ceremony. The wolf hunt would test more than Luke's tracking skills. It would test whether their partnership was strong enough to survive the challenges that lay ahead. The fever came without warning on the 3rd day, after Luke had ridden down to town to accept the wolf hunting contract. Emma woke shivering despite the warm autumn morning, her body aching as if she'd been trampled by horses. By midday, she could barely stand without the world spinning around her like a child's top. The simple wedding ring Luke had fashioned from a piece of silver ore caught the firelight as Emma's trembling fingers gripped the edge of their rough table. The band had become more than just a symbol of their hasty marriage. It represented the steady presence of a man who'd proven his worth through actions rather than words. Now, with Luke away tracking wolves and Emma burning with fever in their mountain cabin, that simple ring felt like her only connection to safety. She'd been alone for 3 days, managing well enough until the sickness struck. Luke had left her with detailed instructions about maintaining the fire, securing their food supplies against bears, and using the rifle if necessary for protection. But he hadn't anticipated illness, and Emma realized with growing alarm that she might be facing a crisis beyond her limited mountain skills. The fever climbed through the afternoon, bringing with it a bone-deep weakness that made even simple tasks nearly impossible. Emma forced herself to drink water from their barrel, knowing dehydration could be fatal, but keeping anything down required tremendous effort. Every joint in her body ached, and strange dreams flickered at the edges of her consciousness, even when she was awake. By evening, Emma was delirious enough to imagine Luke's voice calling her name from the forest. The hallucination was so vivid that she actually struggled to her feet and called back, "Luke, I'm here," before collapsing again as reality reasserted itself. He was miles away, tracking dangerous predators with men from town. He wouldn't return for days, possibly weeks. The night brought terrifying dreams, mixed with periods of semi-consciousness, when Emma wasn't sure whether the sounds she heard were real or imaginary. Mountain cats screamed in the distance, or perhaps they were only fever phantoms. The fire burned low, and she lacked the strength to add more wood, leaving their shelter increasingly cold and dark. Dawn found Emma barely conscious, her lips cracked from dehydration and her skin burning with fever. She'd managed to crawl close enough to the dying fire to feel its minimal warmth, but movement beyond that seemed impossible. Part of her mind remained clear enough to understand that she was in serious danger. Mountain fever had killed stronger people than her, and she was facing it entirely alone. That's when she heard the real sound of approaching horses, not the fever dreams that had tormented her through the night. Male voices, growing closer, and then boots on the wooden platform Luke had built outside their lean-to shelter. "Mrs. Carver? Emma?" The voice belonged to Doc Peterson from Cedar Falls, though Emma couldn't understand why he would be visiting their remote mountain camp. "She's in here, Doc," came another voice, Tom Bradley, the man who'd hired Luke for the wolf hunt. "Luke sent word that she was feeling poorly when he left. Thought we should check on her." Emma tried to respond, but managed only a weak croak. Strong hands lifted her carefully, and she found herself looking up into the weathered face of the frontier doctor who served the scattered settlements around Cedar Falls. "Mountain fever, no question," Doc Peterson muttered, pressing a cool hand against Emma's burning forehead. "She's dehydrated and running a dangerous temperature. Good thing Luke sent that message, or we might have found her too late." Through her fever haze, Emma heard fragments of conversation as the doctor worked to get fluids into her system and reduce her temperature with cool compresses. Luke had apparently sent word through a passing trapper that Emma wasn't feeling well, asking the townspeople to check on her. Even while tracking wolves miles away, he'd been thinking about her welfare. The next few days blurred together in a haze of fever dreams and gradual recovery. Doc Peterson had moved Emma down to town where proper nursing care was available, despite her weak protests about wanting to wait for Luke's return. Mrs. Pemberton, the boarding house owner, proved to be a capable nurse with experience treating mountain fever. "Your husband's quite devoted to you, Mrs. Pemberton observed as Emma finally regained enough strength to sit up and take solid food. Most men would have left their wives to fend for themselves rather than interrupt important work to send for help. Emma touched her wedding ring, which had never left her finger despite the fever's ravages. "He's a good man," she said quietly. "Better than I had any right to expect. Better than most folks in town gave him credit for," Mrs. Pemberton agreed. "There's been talk, you know, about that hasty marriage of yours. Some thought he was taking advantage of a desperate woman. Others figured you were after whatever money a mountain man might have saved up. But a man who interrupts a paying job to make sure his wife is cared for, that's not opportunism. That's love. Love." Emma turned the word over in her mind as she slowly regained her strength. She'd entered their marriage expecting nothing more than mutual respect and practical partnership. But somewhere in the process of learning to live in the mountains, of watching Luke's patient teaching and gentle consideration, her feelings had deepened into something she hadn't dared name. Luke returned to town 5 days later, his horse tired from hard riding, and his face showing the strain of worry and sleepless nights. Emma was sitting on the boarding house porch, still weak but clearly recovering, when he rode up the main street. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and covered the distance to the porch in long strides. "Emma," he said, his voice rough with relief. "Doc Peterson said the fever broke yesterday, but I needed to see for myself." Emma rose carefully to her feet, still unsteady but determined to meet him properly. "You came back," she said, though she'd never doubted he would. "Of course I came back." Luke's hands hovered near her shoulders, as if he wanted to embrace her but wasn't sure it would be welcome. "When I got word you were sick, nothing else mattered. Not the wolves, not the money, nothing, but the job." "Finished," Luke said curtly. "Tracked the pack to their den, eliminated the threat. Bradley has your money." He paused, studying her face with those perceptive grey eyes. "Emma, I need to tell you something. These past few days, thinking I might lose you before I'd even had a chance to—" Emma stepped closer, placing her hand over his heart. "I know," she said softly. "I felt it too, during the fever. The fear of leaving things unsaid, feelings unexpressed." Luke's arms finally came around her, carefully, as if she might break. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I didn't expect it. Didn't plan for it, but somewhere between that first evening in town and now, you became everything I didn't know I was missing." Emma leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him and knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "I love you too," she whispered, "my mountain man, my husband." Around them, the people of Cedar Falls watched this display of genuine affection with grudging approval. Perhaps this unlikely marriage might work after all. Perhaps love could grow in the most unexpected soil, between the most unlikely partners. But even as Emma savored the security of Luke's arms and the warmth of his declared love, she couldn't shake the memory of those hidden letters and the questions they raised about his past. Love was a foundation, but lasting marriages required honesty, and Luke was still keeping secrets that might threaten everything they were building together. The wanted poster arrived with the weekly mail delivery to Cedar Falls, carried by a territorial marshal who'd been tracking leads across 3 states. Emma saw it first, nailed to the post outside the general store, while Luke was inside settling accounts from the wolf hunt. Her blood turned to ice water as she read the bold lettering, "Wanted, Lucas Carver, alias Luke Carrington, robbery, grand theft, 500 reward." The detailed description matched her husband perfectly: height, weight, distinctive grey eyes, even the small scar on his left hand from a childhood accident he'd once mentioned. But it was the name Luke Carrington that made her stomach clench with recognition. She'd seen that name before, written in elegant script on the letters hidden beneath their cabin's floorboards. Emma forced herself to read the entire poster with growing horror. Lucas Carrington was wanted in connection with a series of bank robberies across Colorado and Wyoming territories between 1878 and 1882. The crimes had netted thousands of dollars, and while no murders were attributed to the suspect, Several bank employees had been injured during the robberies. The poster noted that Carrington was considered extremely dangerous and should not be approached by civilians. The man she'd married, the gentle mountain man who'd rescued her from humiliation and nursed her through fever, he was a wanted criminal with a substantial price on his head. Emma's hands shook as she tore the poster from the post, crumpling it against her chest as if she could somehow make the words disappear. Around her, the normal bustle of Cedar Falls continued unchanged. No one else had noticed the poster yet, but it was only a matter of time before someone saw it and recognized the description. Luke emerged from the store carrying supplies, his face relaxed and content in the way she'd learned to treasure. The wolf hunt had been successful, earning them enough money to begin serious work on rebuilding their cabin before winter. For the first time since their marriage, they'd been making real plans for the future, discussing the number of rooms they wanted, whether to add a proper kitchen, how to design the layout for maximum warmth and efficiency. Now everything was crashing down around them. "Emma?" Luke's voice carried concern as he noticed her distress. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emma glanced around the busy street, noting how many people were within earshot. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Privately. Now." Luke's expression sharpened with the wariness that never completely left him, even in their most intimate moments. He loaded their supplies onto the pack mule with swift efficiency, and they rode out of town in tense silence. Emma's mind churned with questions, accusations, and a growing sense of betrayal that warred with her love for the man she thought she knew. They were halfway back to their mountain clearing before Emma finally spoke. "Lucas Carrington," she said, watching Luke's shoulders stiffen at the name. "That's who you really are, isn't it?" Luke brought his horse to a stop in the middle of the trail, his hands steady on the reins despite the bombshell Emma had just dropped. "Where did you hear that name?" Emma pulled the crumpled wanted poster from her coat and handed it to him without speaking. Luke studied it for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of what he was thinking. "I see," he said finally. "How long have you known?" "I found the letters under the floorboard 3 weeks ago," Emma admitted. "The ones from your family in Boston. But I didn't know about this until today." Luke folded the poster carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. "We should get home before we discuss this. These mountains have ears, and some conversations are better held in private." The ride back to their clearing felt endless. Emma's emotions swung between anger at his deception and fear for what this revelation meant for their future. If Luke was a wanted criminal, their marriage was built on lies. Worse, his presence in her life put her at risk of being branded an accomplice or accessory to his crimes. At their campsite, Luke methodically unloaded their supplies and tended to the animals before finally turning to face Emma's questions. She'd spent the time preparing herself for this confrontation, but seeing him move through familiar tasks with the same careful competence he'd always shown made her heart ache with confusion. "The poster is accurate," Luke said without preamble. "I robbed 6 banks between 1,878 and 1,882. Took approximately $12,000 in total. Never killed anyone, but I won't claim nobody got hurt in the process." Emma sank onto the log they used as a bench, the blunt confession hitting her like a physical blow. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do such things?" Luke sat across from her, his grey eyes steady but shadowed with old pain. "Because I was young and angry and convinced that the world owed me something for the injustices I'd suffered. Because I thought I could take shortcuts to get what I wanted without considering the consequences." He stared into the distance, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting a story he'd told himself many times. "My real name is Lucas Carrington. My father is Jonathan Carrington, senior partner in one of Boston's most prestigious law firms. I was supposed to follow in his footsteps, join the firm, marry well, live the life of a proper Boston gentleman." Emma waited, sensing there was more to the story than simple rebellion against family expectations. "When I was 22, I fell in love with a girl named Catherine Morrison. She was beautiful, intelligent, and completely unsuitable by my family's standards. Her father was a blacksmith, and she worked as a seamstress to help support her younger siblings. I asked her to marry me. Luke's hands clenched into fists as he continued. My father threatened to disown me if I went through with the marriage, cut off my inheritance, remove me from the firm, make sure I was socially ruined in Boston. I was arrogant enough to think I could make my own way in the world, that love would be enough to overcome practical considerations. Emma began to understand the pain that had driven Luke to the mountains, but it didn't yet explain his turn to crime. Catherine and I eloped, Luke continued. For 6 months, we were happy despite the financial struggles. I worked as a clerk in a smaller law firm, and Catherine continued her sewing work. We were poor but optimistic about our future. Luke's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Catherine died in childbirth. The baby didn't survive either. And because we had no money for proper medical care, because my pride had prevented me from reconciling with my family when we needed help, they both died in a tenement room, while I was too proud to beg my father for assistance. Emma felt tears stinging her eyes as she began to understand the grief and guilt that had shaped Luke's choices. After Catherine's death, I went a little mad, Luke admitted. Blamed my father, blamed society, blamed anyone except myself for what had happened. I decided that if the world was going to punish me for following my heart, then I'd punish it right back. Started robbing banks, targeting institutions that represented everything I'd come to hate about money and social position. The pieces of his story were falling into place, but Emma still struggled to reconcile the criminal he described with the gentle man who'd rescued her from humiliation. What changed? What made you stop? Luke managed a bitter smile. Got shot during the last robbery, barely made it out of town alive, and spent 3 months hiding in an abandoned cabin while the wound healed. Had plenty of time to think about what I'd become, what Catherine would think of the man I'd turned into. Realized that I wasn't honoring her memory. I was destroying everything she'd loved about me. He gestured toward the mountains surrounding their clearing. Came up here to disappear, to become someone different. Spent the first few years expecting bounty hunters to track me down, but gradually realized that Lucas Carrington was presumed dead. Luke Carver could build a new life, make different choices, try to atone for past mistakes. Emma absorbed this revelation in silence, her mind reeling with the implications. The man she'd married was indeed a criminal, but he was also someone who'd spent 15 years trying to become worthy of redemption. The question now was whether that redemption was enough to build a marriage on, and whether the law would ever allow them the peaceful life they'd been building together. I need to know, Emma said carefully. Have you been sending money to the banks you robbed? Is that what the letters from Boston are about? Luke nodded. Every cent I stole, plus interest. My father has been acting as intermediary, funneling restitution payments through his law firm. The account is nearly settled another 2 years, and every victim of my crimes will have been compensated. Emma studied her husband's weathered face, seeing both the man she'd fallen in love with and the criminal whose past could destroy their future. What happens now, Luke? That poster is nailed up in town. Someone will recognize the description eventually. Luke's expression hardened with resolve. Now I pack up and disappear before I bring trouble down on you. This was always a possibility, Emma. I should have told you from the beginning, should have given you the choice of whether to tie your life to a wanted man's. Emma stood abruptly, anger flaring through her confusion and fear. Don't you dare make that decision for me, Lucas Carrington. I married you for better or worse, and I meant those vows even if they were spoken hastily. We'll figure this out together, or not at all. Luke looked up at her with something that might have been hope, struggling against despair. Emma, you don't understand. If they catch me, if bounty hunters come looking, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Emma interrupted firmly. But I won't let you disappear into the mountains again, not when we've built something real together. Whatever your past, Luke, you're not the same man who robbed those banks. And I'm not the helpless woman who needed rescuing in Cedar Falls. We're partners now, and partners don't abandon each other when things get difficult. Luke rose slowly to his feet, studying Emma's determined expression. You realize what you're saying? If you stay with me, you become an accessory after the fact. Your reputation, your safety, everything you've built here. Everything I've built here is with you, Emma said firmly, and I choose to keep building, whatever the risks. But Luke, no more secrets. If we're going to face this together, I need to know everything. No more hidden letters, no more carefully edited stories. Complete honesty, or this marriage doesn't survive. Luke nodded slowly, understanding that Emma was offering him something precious and fragile, not just forgiveness, but partnership in whatever trials lay ahead. The question was whether their love was strong enough to survive the storms that were surely coming. The warning came at dawn from an unexpected source, old Pete Jameson, the town drunk who sobered up just long enough to ride hard into the mountains with news that could save their lives. Emma heard his horse stumbling up the rocky trail before she saw the man himself, swaying in the saddle and calling Luke's name with desperate urgency. Luke! Luke Carver! Pete's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. They're coming for you, boy. 3 of them bastards rode into town yesterday asking questions, and they got that poster memorized better than scripture. Luke emerged from their rebuilt cabin, rifle in hand, and instantly alert. Over the past 2 months since Emma's discovery of his true identity, they'd lived with the constant awareness that his past might catch up with them. Now, that possibility had become reality. Who's coming, Pete? Luke asked, helping the older man down from his trembling horse. What did they look like? Pete accepted the cup of coffee Emma pressed into his shaking hands, his weathered face grim with urgency. Bounty hunters, sure as I'm standing here. Leader's a big man, mean-looking, with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, called himself Morrison. The other 2 looked like they'd cut their own mother's throats for pocket change. Emma felt ice forming in her veins. Morrison, that had been Catherine's maiden name, Luke's first wife, who died in childbirth. Could this be a relative seeking personal vengeance rather than just professional reward? Luke's face had gone stone hard at the name. Did he say why he was hunting Lucas Carrington specifically? Was it just about the reward money? That's the thing, Pete said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He weren't asking about no Lucas Carrington. He was asking about the man who killed his sister 20 years ago. Said he'd been tracking you across half the territory, waiting for you to surface somewhere you couldn't run. Luke's rifle, a precision instrument he'd maintained with religious care through 15 years of mountain life, seemed to grow heavier in his hands. This wasn't just about old bank robberies anymore. This was about family honor and personal vengeance, the kind of motivation that wouldn't be satisfied by legal justice or financial restitution. Catherine Morrison, Luke said quietly, the name carrying the weight of old grief. She had a brother named James. He was 16 when she died, blamed me for taking her away from their family, said I'd killed her as sure as if I'd put a gun to her head. Emma felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. He's been hunting you all these years, not for the money but for revenge? 20 years is a long time to carry that kind of hate, Luke replied, his grey eyes scanning the tree line automatically for signs of approaching danger. But some wounds never heal, especially when you lose the only family you have left. Pete finished his coffee and struggled back to his feet. They was asking about trails up to your place, about how many people lived up here, about whether you had family with you. Tom Bradley didn't tell them nothing, but there's others in town who might talk for the right price. Emma's hand instinctively moved to the small of her back, where Luke had taught her to carry a concealed pistol. The weapon felt alien against her spine, but she'd become proficient with it during their months of preparation for exactly this kind of threat. How much head start do we have? Luke asked, already moving toward their supply cache. Left town just after midnight, Pete replied, but they was planning to wait for better light before heading up the mountain. Figure you got maybe 4 hours, maybe 6 if they're cautious about the trail. Luke and Emma moved with the synchronized efficiency of partners who'd rehearsed this scenario many times. Their go-bag contained essential supplies for survival in the wilderness: ammunition, dried food, basic medical supplies, and enough gold coins to start over in Canada or Mexico if necessary. But Emma found herself reluctant to abandon the life they'd built together in this mountain clearing. "We could run," she said as Luke checked his rifle's action for the 100th time. "Take the horses, head north toward the Canadian border, start over somewhere else." Luke paused in his preparations, studying her face with those perceptive grey eyes. "Is that what you want, Emma? Another new beginning, another set of identities, always looking over our shoulders?" Emma thought about the cabin they'd spent months rebuilding, the garden she'd planted with seeds saved from their first harvest, the life they'd crafted from nothing but mutual respect and growing love. Running meant abandoning all of that, becoming fugitives in truth rather than just in legal status. "No," she said firmly. "I'm tired of running from other people's mistakes, Luke. Your mistakes, Roland Hutchins' mistakes, my sister's social climbing. I've spent my whole adult life dealing with the consequences of choices other people made. This time, I want to make my own choice." Luke set down his rifle and took her hands in his weathered ones. "Emma, James Morrison isn't coming here for justice or money. He's coming for blood. If we stay and fight, one of us might not survive. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Emma looked around their mountain sanctuary, taking in the solid cabin walls that represented months of shared labor, the stone foundation that spoke of permanence and commitment, the life they'd built from nothing but hope and determination. "I'm prepared to fight for what's ours," she said steadily. "This is our home, Luke, our life. If James Morrison wants to take that away from us, he'll have to do it over my dead body." Luke's smile was fierce and proud. "In that case, Mrs. Carver, we'd better make sure we're ready to give these bounty hunters a proper mountain welcome." The next few hours passed in intense preparation. Luke positioned defensive obstacles around their clearing fallen logs that would force attackers to dismount and approach on foot, carefully placed stones that could serve as cover during a firefight, escape routes that would allow them to reach the dense forest if their position became untenable. Emma loaded weapons with methodical precision, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The shy schoolteacher who'd answered Roland Hutchins' advertisement seemed like a different person entirely from the woman who now prepared for armed combat beside her outlaw husband. "Remember," Luke said as he showed her the sightlines and defensive positions he'd prepared, "James Morrison is motivated by grief and hatred that's been festering for 20 years. That makes him dangerous but also predictable. He'll want to get close, want to see my face when he kills me. That gives us an advantage if we're smart about using it." Emma nodded, absorbing tactical information with the same focused attention she'd once applied to lesson plans and student evaluations. "What about the other two, the ones who looked like hired killers?" "Professional bounty hunters care about collecting their reward alive if possible, dead if necessary," Luke replied. "They'll be more cautious, more methodical, probably hang back and let Morrison take the emotional risks while they wait for clean shots." As the sun climbed higher, they took positions inside their cabin, where they could observe the approaches to their clearing while remaining concealed. Luke's rifle commanded the main trail, while Emma covered the back approach with her shotgun, a weapon Luke had chosen specifically for its effectiveness at close range and its psychological impact on attackers. "Emma," Luke said during a quiet moment as they waited for their enemies to arrive, "I need you to know something. Whatever happens today, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever when Catherine died, the belief that I could be worthy of someone's love." Emma reached across the space between them to squeeze his free hand. "You are worthy, Luke, not because of what you've done to atone for your past, but because of who you choose to be every day. James Morrison is wrong about you. You didn't kill his sister, Poverty and lack of medical care killed her, along with the social systems that made proper treatment impossible for working-class families. Luke's expression softened with gratitude, but before he could reply, the sound of approaching horses announced that their time for conversation had ended. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, moving with the careful precision of men who expected trouble and were prepared to dish out more than they received. The leader matched Pete's description perfectly, a big man with a livid scar marking his face and eyes that burned with 2 decades of accumulated hatred. James Morrison had grown from the grieving 16-year-old boy Luke, remembered into something harder and more dangerous, shaped by years of nursing his desire for revenge. "Lucas Carrington," Morrison's voice carried clearly across the clearing. "I know you're in there. 20 years I've been looking for you, 20 years of following cold trails and dead ends. But now I've found you, and it's time to settle accounts for what you did to my sister." Luke rose slowly, showing himself in the cabin doorway, but keeping the rifle ready. "Hello, James. You've grown up since I last saw you." Morrison's scarred face twisted with rage. "Don't you dare speak to me like we're old friends. You killed Catherine as sure as if you'd put a bullet in her heart. Took her away from her family, got her pregnant, and let her die in poverty while you were too proud to ask for help." Emma watched the confrontation unfold, her finger resting lightly on her shotgun's trigger. The other 2 bounty hunters had spread out to flank their position, but they seemed content to let Morrison take the lead in this personal confrontation. "You're right," Luke said, his voice carrying across the clearing with quiet conviction. "I was too proud, too young, too stupid to put Catherine's welfare ahead of my own wounded feelings. She died because of choices I made, and I've spent every day since then trying to become worthy of her memory." Morrison's response was a wordless roar of rage as he spurred his horse forward, drawing his gun as he charged toward the cabin where Luke and Emma had made their stand. The first shot shattered the morning silence as James Morrison's horse thundered across the clearing, his revolver blazing wildly as grief and rage overcame tactical sense. Luke's return fire was precise and measured, not aimed to kill, but to disable, the bullet catching Morrison in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. Emma's shotgun roared from the cabin's side window, the blast aimed at the second bounty hunter who'd been circling toward their rear approach. The weapon Luke had chosen for her proved its worth. The spread of shot didn't require perfect accuracy, and the thunderous report sent the man's horse rearing in panic. 2 down, 1 to go. Luke called out, already reloading with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd learned combat skills the hard way. "Stay down, Emma," the third one smart enough to wait for a clear shot. Emma crouched below the window frame, her heart hammering against her ribs as she fumbled fresh shells into her shotgun's chamber. The shy schoolteacher who'd once fainted at the sight of blood during a student's playground accident had been replaced by someone harder, more capable, a woman who could function under fire because her husband's life depended on it. Morrison was cursing from behind the overturned log where he'd taken cover, his wounded shoulder making his gun hand unsteady, but his voice still carrying 20 years of accumulated hatred. "You think you can hide behind that woman's skirts forever, Carrington? Come out and face me like a man." "I'm not hiding from anything, James," Luke replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "But I'm not going to make it easy for you to collect that bounty either. Your sister wouldn't have wanted this. Catherine believed in forgiveness, in second chances." Morrison's response was another wild shot that splintered wood near Luke's position. "Don't you dare speak her name. You lost the right to mention Catherine when you let her die in that filthy tenement." Emma risked a quick glance through her window and spotted the third bounty hunter, a lean, professional-looking man who'd positioned himself in the tree line with a rifle, waiting patiently for either Luke or Emma to expose themselves. Unlike Morrison, this one wasn't driven by personal vengeance. He was simply doing a job, and that made him more dangerous in some ways. "Luke," Emma called softly. "The one with the rifle, he's got a clear shot at the main door if you try to move." Luke nodded grimly, understanding their tactical situation. They were effectively pinned down in their own cabin, with two wounded but still dangerous opponents and a third who was content to wait for them to make a mistake. That's when Emma remembered something Luke had shown her during their defensive preparations, a trapdoor he'd built into the cabin floor that connected to a root cellar, which in turn had a concealed exit that emerged in the dense brush behind their position. "The root cellar," Emma whispered. "I can circle around, get behind the rifleman." Luke's expression was sharp with concern. "Emma, no. Too risky. If something goes wrong." "If we stay pinned down here, we're dead anyway," Emma interrupted, checking her shotgun's load one more time. "That man with the rifle isn't going to get impatient like Morrison did. He'll wait us out until we run out of ammunition or water or patience." Luke studied her determined face and saw not the helpless bride he'd rescued months ago, but a woman who'd proven herself capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. "Stay low, move fast, and don't take any chances you don't have to. If you get in trouble, just run. I'll find a way to come after you." Emma squeezed his hand briefly, then dropped through the trapdoor into the cool darkness of the root cellar. The tunnel Luke had dug as an emergency exit was narrow and rough, barely wide enough for her shoulders, but it led away from the cabin toward the concealed exit he'd carefully camouflaged among the mountain brush. Above her, she could hear Morrison still shouting challenges and threats, his voice growing hoarse with pain and fury. The second bounty hunter had apparently remounted his frightened horse and was now positioning himself to support his professional partner's patient siege. Emma emerged from the tunnel into dense undergrowth, her heart pounding as she oriented herself and began working her way around toward the rifleman's position. Every step had to be silent, every movement calculated to avoid detection. The skills Luke had taught her for moving through wilderness without disturbing the wildlife now served her in deadly earnest. Through the trees, she could see the professional bounty hunter in his concealed position, rifle trained on their cabin door with steady patience. He was good at his job, positioned with clear sight lines, protected by cover, close enough to the other attackers to coordinate, but far enough away to avoid being caught in crossfire. Emma worked her way closer, using every trick Luke had taught her about moving silently through forest terrain. Her shotgun was heavy in her hands, and sweat made her grip slippery despite the cool mountain air. She'd never shot at a human being before, wasn't sure she could pull the trigger when the moment came. But then she thought about Luke waiting in the cabin, about the life they'd built together, about the future that would be stolen. The bounty hunter spun toward Emma's voice, his rifle swinging in her direction with practiced speed. But Emma was ready. Her shotgun boomed before he could complete his turn, the blast catching him in the leg and sending him tumbling behind his makeshift cover with a cry of pain and surprise. "Emma!" Luke's voice carried relief and concern as the sound of her shot echoed across the clearing. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Emma called back, already moving to a new position as Luke had taught her. "Never stay in one place after firing. Assume your enemies now know where you are and plan accordingly." The wounded rifleman was cursing creatively from behind his fallen log, but Emma could see he was still dangerous. The shotgun blast had disabled his leg, not his shooting arm, and he was already working to get his rifle back into position. That's when the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of unexpected reinforcements. Emma's heart sank, thinking more bounty hunters had found their remote clearing, but the voice that called out across the battlefield carried the authority of legitimate law enforcement. "This is Marshal Tom Patterson, Territorial Law Enforcement. Lower your weapons and identify yourselves." Emma risked a glance toward the main trail and saw 3 riders wearing the distinctive badges of territorial marshals. The lead rider was a gray-haired man with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades keeping order in frontier country. James Morrison's response was predictable, another wild shot in the marshal's direction, his grief and rage making rational surrender impossible. "Stay out of this," Carrington killed my sister, and I'm going to see justice done." Marshal Patterson's voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Mr. Morrison, you're wanted for questioning in connection with 3 illegal bounty hunting operations and 2 civilian deaths. Drop your weapon and surrender peacefully." Luke emerged from the cabin slowly, his hands visible but still holding his rifle. "Marshal Patterson, I'm Lucas Carrington. I assume you're here about the bank robberies from 20 years ago." "Among other things," the marshal replied, dismounting carefully while keeping his own weapon ready. "We've been tracking Mr. Morrison and his associates for 6 months. They're not legitimate bounty hunters, they're criminals using old wanted posters to justify robbery and murder." Emma felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion. If Morrison and his men were criminals rather than legitimate law enforcement, what did that mean for Luke's legal status? The wounded rifleman made his choice at that moment, attempting to line up a shot at the marshals from his concealed position. Emma's second shotgun blast ended that threat permanently, the man slumping behind his log without another sound. Marshal Patterson nodded approvingly in Emma's direction. "Good shooting, ma'am. Professional bounty hunters don't usually bring their wives to gunfights." "We're not bounty hunters," Luke said firmly. "I'm a former outlaw trying to make restitution for old crimes. Emma is my wife, and we were defending our home against armed attackers." The second bounty hunter, wounded earlier by Emma's first shot, chose that moment to make a run for his horse. Luke's rifle spoke once, precisely, dropping the man before he could escape or threaten the marshals. "That leaves just Morrison," Patterson observed, studying the clearing with professional assessment. "James, you're surrounded and outgunned. Your associates are dead or disabled. Surrender now, and you'll live to stand trial." Morrison's response was a wordless howl of rage and frustration. 20 years of nursing his hatred for Luke had culminated in this moment, and he wasn't going to let legal technicalities rob him of his revenge. He broke from cover, charging toward Luke's position with his revolver blazing wildly. Luke could have killed him easily. Morrison's wounded shoulder made his aim erratic, and his emotional state had destroyed any tactical sense he might have possessed. Instead, Luke fired once, precisely, the bullet shattering Morrison's hand and ending the threat without taking his life. Morrison fell to his knees in the dirt of the clearing, clutching his shattered hand and weeping with pain and frustrated rage. 20 years of hatred had brought him to this moment of defeat, broken and bleeding in the place where his obsession had finally consumed him. Marshal Patterson approached Morrison carefully, checking him for additional weapons before applying makeshift bandages to his wounds. "James Morrison, you're under arrest for murder, robbery, and impersonating federal officers. You'll be transported to territorial court for trial." Emma emerged from the forest, her shotgun still ready but pointed safely toward the ground. The transformation from abandoned bride to capable frontier woman was now complete. She'd proven herself in combat, protected her husband's life, and helped legitimate law enforcement capture dangerous criminals. "Mr. Carrington," Marshal Patterson said as his deputies secured the scene, "we need to talk about your legal status. There's been some interesting developments regarding those old bank robbery charges." Luke's expression was wary but hopeful. "What kind of developments?" "The kind that involve presidential pardons and official recognition of voluntary restitution efforts," Patterson replied with a slight smile. "Seems your father's law firm has been more active on your behalf than you might have realized. You're not a wanted man anymore, Luke. You're a reformed citizen who's paid his debt to society." Emma felt tears of relief stinging her eyes as the implications sank in. They were free, truly free to build their life together without looking over their shoulders, without fear of bounty hunters or criminal prosecution. The badge of honor that Marshal Patterson handed to Luke was more than just official recognition of his redemption. It was a symbol of everything they'd built together, everything they'd fought to protect, and everything they could now look forward to in their future as partners in both marriage and life. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of their expanded cabin, illuminating pages of the family Bible that lay open on Emma's kitchen table. The book had been her grandmother's, shipped west along with other precious belongings after news of Emma's marriage had reached her scattered relatives back east. Now it served as the foundation of their new life together, its margins filled with carefully recorded births, marriages, and the milestones that marked the passage of time in their mountain sanctuary. Emma's hand rested gently on the slight curve of her belly as she read the morning passage, a habit she'd developed since discovering her pregnancy 3 weeks earlier. The child growing within her would be born into a world of security and love that neither she nor Luke had dared hope for during those desperate early days of their marriage. Luke entered the kitchen from his morning chores, moving with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. The deputy sheriff's badge he now wore represented more than legal redemption. It symbolized his transformation from someone running from his past to someone actively building a better future for his community. "Morning, Mrs. Carver," he said, bending to kiss her forehead with the gentle affection that had replaced their initial careful politeness. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Emma replied, closing the Bible and rising to prepare their breakfast. "The morning sickness seems to be easing, and I think I might actually be hungry for the first time in weeks." Luke's smile was warm with contentment as he watched her move around their kitchen with practiced efficiency. The shy schoolteacher who'd answered Roland Hutchins' advertisement had evolved into something remarkable, a woman equally comfortable, teaching wilderness skills to local children and hosting the social gatherings that had become a regular feature of their mountain community. Their cabin had grown beyond the simple shelter they'd originally planned. The main room now featured a proper fireplace with Luke's expert stonework, comfortable furniture built from local timber, and windows that framed the spectacular mountain views like living paintings. A separate bedroom provided privacy and comfort, while Emma's small study held her expanding collection of books and the correspondence that connected them to the wider world. "Marshal Patterson sent word yesterday," Luke said as they shared their morning meal. "The territorial governor wants to expand the deputy sheriff program to cover more of the remote settlements. He's offered me a permanent position with authority over the entire mountain district." Emma looked up from her coffee, studying her husband's weathered face. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd discuss it with my wife before making any decisions," Luke replied with a slight smile. "This affects both of us, Emma. If I accept the position, it means more travel, more time away from home, more responsibility for keeping peace in places where the nearest law might be days away." Emma considered the implications carefully. Luke's work as a deputy had already proven invaluable to their scattered mountain community, mediating disputes between ranchers, tracking criminals who thought the wilderness would hide their activities, and serving as the voice of legitimate authority in places where might too often made right. "You enjoy the work," she observed, "and you're good at it. The people trust you, respect your judgment, look to you for leadership." Luke nodded slowly. "It's strange, finding purpose in upholding laws I once broke, but there's satisfaction in using skills I learned as an outlaw to protect innocent people from the kind of criminals I used to be." Emma reached across the table to take his weathered hand in hers. "Then we'll make it work. This community needs you, Luke, and our child will grow up proud to have a father who stands for justice and protection of the innocent." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, not the desperate urgency that had marked the arrival of bounty hunters, but the leisurely pace of friends coming to visit. Through their window, Emma could see Tom Bradley and his wife Sarah, along with Doc Peterson and several other families from Cedar Falls. "What's all this about?" Emma asked, but Luke's knowing smile suggested he was expecting their visitors. The group gathered in their main room, filling the space with warmth and laughter as children played among the adults and conversation flowed easily between old friends. It was Sarah Bradley who finally called for attention, rising to address Luke and Emma with obvious pleasure. "We came up here today to share some news," Sarah announced. the Territorial Church Council has approved our request to establish a proper congregation in Cedar Falls. We'll have a real church building within the year, and we need someone to serve as the community's moral and spiritual advisor." She paused, looking directly at Emma. "We'd like you to consider serving as our teacher and church organist, Emma. Your education and experience make you the natural choice, and frankly, we can't think of anyone better suited to help shape the minds and hearts of our children." Emma felt a surge of unexpected emotion at this recognition of her worth, beyond her role as Luke's wife. These people were offering her the chance to use her education and training in service of something larger than herself, the kind of meaningful work she'd always dreamed of doing. "The position comes with a proper salary," Tom Bradley added, "enough to make the weekly trip down from your mountain worthwhile, with accommodation in town when weather makes the journey impossible." Luke squeezed Emma's hand encouragingly. "It's your decision, Emma." Emma looked around the room at the faces of people who'd initially judged her hasty marriage with skepticism, but had come to accept and value both her and Luke as integral parts of their community. The abandoned bride who'd stood on those church steps months ago had found not just a husband, but a home and a purpose that fulfilled her in ways she'd never imagined possible. "I accept," she said simply, and the room erupted in pleased congratulations. As the afternoon wore on, and their visitors eventually departed, Emma and Luke stood together on their cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. The same colors that had blessed their first meeting now seemed to promise continued happiness for their growing family. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked quietly, "giving up your solitary mountain life for marriage and community responsibilities?" Luke pulled her closer against his side, his voice warm with contentment. "I told you once that I didn't remember women being this beautiful, but I was wrong, Emma. It wasn't just about beauty, it was about finding someone who could see the man I was trying to become, instead of just the man I used to be." Emma leaned into his embrace, feeling their child move gently within her and knowing that their story was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build something lasting and meaningful in this mountain wilderness they'd claimed as home. But tonight, as stars emerged in the darkening sky above their peaceful valley, Emma and Luke Carver stood together as partners in the truest sense, two people who'd found in each other the courage to become more than they'd ever dreamed possible.